December.
Today's the 13th.
13th?
Right, Chris? Today's the 13th.
Today is the 13th.
Should I put on my watch, Sue? I'm sorry.
Does this show in the image? The drawing phone? Nope. It doesn't have to.
So it cuts off right around here.
That's good.
Okay.
Just right around there is when it cuts off.
Yes.
Ready for countdown? In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening. This is ZENtalk from the Atlanta Soto Zen Center in Atlanta, Georgia. It's December 13th, and Thursday evening, and we are hosted by Yusen Yuen Komyo, who is here from San Francisco by way of Los Angeles Zen Center. She's had much experience training in other centers. And tonight, she is going to interview me about the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra is a brief chant that is done in most Zen centers around the world. And the English version of it probably is pretty much confined to the West. We also chant it in Japanese. The Hanya Shingyo is called. And we will chant it for you tonight, one time. And then Komyo is going to ask questions about the Heart Sutra and what its meaning may represent for us. This month, December of the year, is when we pay special attention to Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching. This is the month that we celebrate Rohatsu, which we did just this last week with his Enlightenment Day on December 8th, which happened to be a Saturday this year, which is the evening that we sat up all night in recognition of his the story about Shakyamuni Buddha sitting up all night, night of his awakening. So please listen or join us, if you will, in the Heart Sutra. We'll chant through this one time, and then we will begin the interview process. Heart of great perfect wisdom sutra. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing Prajna Paramita, clearly saw that all five aggregates are empty, thus transcending all suffering. Shariputra, form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. Form itself emptiness. Emptiness is itself, form, sensation, perceptions, formation, and consciousness are also like this. Shariputra, all dharmas are marked emptiness. They neither arise nor cease, are neither defiled nor pure, neither increase nor decrease. Therefore, given emptiness, there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no object of mind, no realm of sight, realm of mind consciousness. There is neither ignorance nor extinction of ignorance, nor old age and death, nor extinction of old age and death, no suffering, no cause, cessation, no path, no knowledge, and no attainment, with nothing to attain. A bodhisattva realized prajna paramita, and thus the mind is without hindrance. Without hindrance, there is no fear. Far beyond all inverted views, one realizes nirvana, all but of past, present, and future on prajna paramita, and thereby attain unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. Therefore, know the prajna paramita as the great miraculous mantra, the great right mantra, incomparable mantra, which removes all suffering and is true, not false. Therefore we proclaim the prajna paramita mantra, the mantra that says Gate Gate Para Gate Parasangate Bodhisattva. So some variation on that particular sutra, which is considered to be a condensation of all of Buddhist teaching into one kind of messaging. You will find chanted at any Zen center around the country and in the world, with different degrees of performance, you might say. It's based on, as I understand, on the Japanese version, it's called Hanya Shingyo, in which the monosyllabic nature of the Japanese language is Kanji Zai Bo Satsu Gyojin Hanya Haramita. It's a little more fitting to the tempo, perhaps. English does not quite fit that tempo. But we chant it in this manner as a way of paying some deference to our Japanese ancestors and to the way the sutra is chanted in Japan. So tonight we're going to turn to the content and meaning of the sutra. And Komyo, Yuen will be interviewing me as to questions that she has about the meaning of this sutra.
I am sure there are thousands of questions that can be asked, but I'll start with the title, Sansei. It's called in English Heart of the Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra, or sometimes people in short call it the Heart Sutra. Why is it called the Heart Sutra?
My understanding is that it represents the heart of the teaching. It represents all of Buddha's teachings kind of condensed into one brief chant that can act as a reminder to all of us as to the nature of his teachings. From Bill Porter, Red Pine, who published a book on this called About the Heart Sutra. he said that this was published somewhere in China around 900, somewhere in that era, I think. And he said it was published as a kind of corrective that, as has happened many times in the history of Zen, the sort of emphasis in the practice had gone very far over to the side of intellectualism, erudition, scholarship, the ability to quote sutras, kind of made the difference or distinction between different teachers. And this was published, as I understand, from Red Pine, as a kind of corrective that it's saying essentially, wait a minute, Buddha said even his own teachings are empty, that is, they are not to be concretized or raised to the level of obiter dictum or something of that nature, where we are to try to reify these teachings. We are to, rather than discover their true meaning in our own experience. And so the heart, I think, means both heart, mind, shin. I'm not sure of the Japanese word that is used. It is hanya shingyo, so shin, I think, in Japanese and Chinese means heart, mind. So this is the heart of the Buddha's teachings, where he's trying to explain emptiness, essentially. What is the experience of emptiness, which comes about through our meditation?
That's actually my next question. In terms of it definitely talks a lot about the core beliefs and teachings from the Buddha Dharma. But what would you glean from it in terms of what are the main teachings? I think you mentioned one of them is emptiness. Is that correct?
Well, if you look at the beginning, it begins with, first of all, there's something a little mysterious here about where Buddha is talking, and he's talking to Shariputra, who was one of his 10 major disciples. But he's talking about Avalokiteshvara. This is a statue representing Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, with many heads, many eyes to see and hear, and many ears to hear the suffering of the world, and coming with many, many implements to help. So this figure, Avalokiteshvara in India, became assimilated, you might say, with Kuan Yin in China, as I understand it. And in Japan, it's called Kanzeon or Kanon Bodhisattva. So it's a bodhisattva that is envisioned as coming to enlightenment by hearing the sounds of suffering of the world. They're coming to help the world with all of these implements and tools, which look a little bit like weapons, but they're meant to be various skillful means of helping. So it's a little bit strange in that Shakyamuni seems to be speaking to Shariputra by channeling Avalokiteshvara, or speaking about the profound experience Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, has in seeing that all 5 aggregates are empty. The aggregates of form, feeling, thought, impulse, consciousness, variously translated into English terms, and thus relieved all suffering. So these 5 aggregates are the world of a sentient being. We experience form. We all sit in the reality of form as a physical experience. Sensation is the energetic level, you might say, of our experience. Form, feeling or sensation. Thought is a little more ephemeral, a little more diaphanous, you might say, moving away from the concrete or gross level of form and sensation into a conceptual realm. Impulse, or sometimes mental formations, these are kind of underlying, maybe subconscious or subliminal impulses that underlie all of our thought and motivations to take action. And finally, consciousness itself is sort of the umbrella aggregate, or skanda. I started to say skanda. Skanda is the Sanskrit term for the same meaning. Skanda means something like a heap or a pile. Well, these 5 kind of aggregates or skandhas are the way that Buddhism defined a model of sentient existence. And testifying here, he's talking to Shariputra. He's saying that what Avalokiteshvara came to see is that these 5 aggregates of sentient being are all, in essence, empty. And so then moves on to form and emptiness, form itself and emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form, and so forth. And then the senses, sensation, perception, formation. These are the aggregates, sensation, perception, formation, consciousness, as well as form, are also like this. Then goes into all dharmas. That means dharma has a sense of being. Everything that exists are marked by emptiness. They neither arise nor cease. So it's teaching the principle of impermanence, that everything that comes into existence is not self-existent. It does not have any continuing permanence of existence. And goes on to say that because of this, also our senses are themselves empty. No eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. No sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, and so forth. And no object of mind, no realm of sight, no realm of mind consciousness. So this is a little bit difficult to accept, right, as a fundamental teaching, because everybody says, well, I have eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind. I see, I hear, I feel, smell, taste, touch, think. So what does this mean? I think what it's getting at is that the way we experience the 5 skandhas of sentient being, 5 aggregates, and the way we experience our own senses is biased. It's also incomplete. So our meditative process, this is speaking of the emptiness, this is testifying really to the emptiness that is experienced in meditation. This is not a separate philosophical tract that has to do with an objective view of the world. It's describing what actually happens in our meditation. So I think that's the principal statement here, the principal meaning here. The thread running through this is Buddha's testimony to what happens in meditation. And this goes all the way back to, we might consider mythical, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. This is my understanding, but I'm not a historian, I'm not a scholar.
Well, you're right. I mean, this is probably kind of confusing and crazy, especially for Western thinkers. If they come into this and try to understand it the first several weeks, I think it's probably virtually impossible. And one question, just taking their point of view, I would say there's such a big emphasis placed on emptiness and nothing being permanent, or to attain, even says, then why do we bother? What do we tell a new beginner? It's like, if nothing's permanent, it's just all temporary. And there's even here it says there's no path, no knowledge, no attainment of any sort. Then why do we bother to practice or to be good? Like, what's all this? What is the purpose?
It does seem contradictory, doesn't it? If you think about it, we come into the practice with all kinds of ideas, and even before we try to practice Zen, we have all kinds of ideas about things that we can attain, that we can attain insight, we can attain enlightenment, and so forth. So this is to my way of thinking, this is kind of the comforting message that, in spite of the fact that we have all of this aspiration to attainment, he's saying that for a bodhisattva is an enlightening being who dedicates their life his or her life to propagating this kind of practice for the salvation of all. And the salvation does not mean saving your soul in a religious sense. It means saving yourself from your own ignorance. So giving up some of our preconceptions or ideals about that there could be such a thing as attainment. There's something we can attain or achieve. With nothing to attain, a bodhisattva relies on prajnaparamita. Now, prajnaparamita, Sanskrit for the perfection of wisdom. So the perfection of wisdom it seems circular, it turns back on itself, that relying on prajnaparamita, or relying on the perfection of wisdom itself, does not seem, it implies a kind of attainment, but it also is saying at the same time, with nothing to attain, the bodhisattva relies on the perfection of wisdom. So this implies that the perfection of wisdom doesn't have to do with attaining anything. So this goes to, I think, the principle of innate Buddhahood or innate enlightenment, that we all have the potential of awakening to Buddha nature. Buddha simply means awake, awakening to an awakened nature which is beyond what we may imagine as our awakened state. But the implication is that it is no attainment because it already exists. It is already our innate original nature. Buddha nature is our innate original nature. So what is in the way and the work that has to be done is ignorance, confusion, our own opinions, and to divest ourselves of those through this meditative practice. So the suggestion here is that whatever occurs through your meditative practice is not really an attainment. You're not gaining anything different that you don't already have, but you're returning to your original nature. Sometimes the expression original nature is used instead of Buddha nature. You're returning to what is at base, at the bottom of your existence, devoid of all of the concepts and confused ideas you have about it. Does that make sense?
In a circular way. But it keeps coming back to, I guess, the title. It says all Buddhas, like you said, all Buddhas of past, present, and future rely on prajnaparamita and thereby, like you said, attain eventually unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. So is there how you describe it, if it's even possible? Is there like, if someone to ask me, what is then prajnaparamita? What would you say?
The perfection of wisdom?
Yes.
It would be to see the truth of the Buddhist teaching, the Four Noble Truths, the existence of suffering, the origin of suffering coming from our own craving, the cessation of suffering coming from relinquishing, being able to finally abandon or relinquish that craving. And Noble Eightfold Path is to, in everyday life, to be able to follow out the actualization of that teaching. So right view, right thought are set up as, you might say, ideals, things to achieve, not some place that you can start. Right speech, action, livelihood, or conduct in everyday life. You talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk. So right speech and right action are not coherent in your existence.
Mm-hmm.
Right livelihood. Buddha's Eightfold Path is kind of describing all of the dimensions of everyday life, not only in his time, but also in ours, that would then manifest or actualize this kind of practice in everyday life. Right effort, mindfulness, meditation are the internal practices or disciplines that nobody sees directly, whereas they do see right speech, action, livelihood. They can see your outer conduct. But through the exercise of these 6 different disciplines, one on the side of right conduct, one on the side of internal or right discipline, eventually we can come to the view or thought of Buddha or Buddhism. So I think this is the idea that we the perfection of wisdom has to do with all of these dimensions of our life, and the internal as well as the external. Somebody said it was inside monk, or inside person, outside person. How do they become just one, where there is no inside outside anymore? Just one. So that becomes, I think, the perfection of wisdom.
And how does it remove all sufferings, according to?
You would have to challenge that. Part of the other part of the sutra says no suffering, no end of suffering. And then toward the end it says removes all suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the given emptiness, no suffering, no end of suffering means that given emptiness, if we come to this kind of realization in our own life, then we can come to the end of inflicting suffering upon ourselves for no good reason. It's bad enough that we suffer. We don't need to beat ourselves up for it. We don't need to blame ourselves, double jeopardy kind of thing. And we can also come to see that everybody else is in the same boat. And so we can stop inflicting suffering on others. So I think when it says, given emptiness, given this realization, no suffering means we can come to the end of this kind of unnecessary mankind, created by humankind, suffering that we inflict on the planet, we inflict on other human beings, and we inflict really back on ourselves. That there is no end of suffering means that the natural I think this is the way I see these two in opposition. The natural suffering of aging, sickness, and death is built into this existence. This is the meaning of the First Noble Truth. To fully understand the existence of suffering means to see that there's no possible existence without this kind of suffering. But that doesn't mean that we need to take it personally and that I need to blame you or you need to blame me and we need to attack each other. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
But then to come to, what is the line you quoted? No.
The toward the end, I mean, like you said, in the middle, it talks about there is no suffering, but then at the end, it talks about also this is an incomparable mantra which removes all suffering.
Removes all suffering. Yeah. So I think you could say it removes your judgment that something is suffering. That is, it's personal suffering to you. We don't use the teachings of Buddhism to excuse the suffering of others and say, oh, it's just their karma. We don't have to do anything about it. We don't use the teachings of Buddhism to blame others, to hold up and criticize them for their behavior. And so it's very personal. All of the doubt in Buddhism is reflected back on the self. So I think what this is saying is that completely removes all suffering means that for you at least, you begin to see that whatever you have considered suffering in the past is unfair, personal, why me, Lord, directed at me. You begin to see that you're not alone, that everybody's in that same situation. And so if it's true for not only everybody, every human being, but all sentient beings, and the insentient world as well, it's suffering change continuously. And if that's the principle, then how can you take it personally? And so for you, this attitude about suffering being directed at you and I'm suffering you begin to see through that. And so it completely ends all suffering. Doesn't mean that anything changes. Doesn't mean that anything in the world changes. Dukkha, the original word, I don't think means suffering in the way we mean it in English, which is very emotion laden. I think it means, as I often say, galaxies colliding are dukkha. It's just inexorable change. And we get caught up in it, and sometimes natural disasters, earthquakes, forest fires, which now we think are maybe not natural, they're humankind, caused by humankind and so forth. Natural disasters we're more accepting of as the will of God, or however we might want to rationalize them. But the actions of other human beings in waging war and wiping out whole civilizations, we cannot find a way to accept that. That's not something we can accept. The only way we can accept that kind of suffering is through their own ignorance. They're acting out of ignorance. And if they had this teaching of Buddhism, which was their own realization of this, then they would not be defensive. They would not be trying to defend themselves by inflicting suffering upon others. So the contradictions that we typically see or find in this kind of teaching, and then when we look at the world, those are based on the idea that we think somehow we could say the acceptance of suffering means the acceptance of injustice, or the acceptance of persecution, the acceptance of genocide, and so forth. It doesn't mean that at all. The Buddhist teaching is not an excuse for inaction, or for accepting the unacceptable behavior of other human beings. And the reason that they behave that way is they don't have this. They don't have this insight. They don't have this understanding. This perfection of wisdom is not part of their world. And so they're acting out of ignorance, and they're acting out of fear.
That's always my question is, would this suffering really ever stop or cease until everyone understand these principles of, basically of emptiness and compassion and what perfect wisdom is? I guess we just keep practicing until somehow someday everybody gets there.
Well, you could hope that it doesn't have to be everybody. You could hope that it could only be the people in power who make determinations about how governments are run or how societies are run. If they became wise in this sense, the perfection of wisdom, then they may be good leaders, good teachers for their societies. So the children growing up don't necessarily have to get this. But at some age, instead of being conditioned to consumerism, or you're only happy if you have money, you're only right, all the things we see societally, the revolution could come about not through 100% of everybody, of all the human beings in the world coming to this kind of awareness and insight, but just enough for those people who are in positions of influence.
Do you feel like we'll get there someday?
Probably not in our lifetime.
Yeah. I hate to end that on that note. Any other remarks you want to make about the Heart Sutra, or the Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra?
Well, we proclaim at the end Prajnaparamita mantra. A mantra, or dharani, is a chant. A dharani in particular usually is not translated. And I've heard dharani used more than mantra for this. Mantra, I think, was a little bit popularized, maybe distorted a little bit by the what was the meditation movement where you'd be given a mantra and you'd repeat the mantra to yourself. It goes back
Like
a couple of generations.
like the Nichiren sect.
No, this was an Indian sect.
Mm.
But the mantra that says Gate Gate Parasam Gate Bodhisattva. This is Dharani is usually not translated into English or to contemporary language because it's thought that the sounds themselves have some transformative power. Gate Gate Parasam Gate Bodhisattva Swaha, roughly translated means something like gone to the other shore, attained the other shore, to beyond the other shore, enlightenment achieved or found enlightenment. So this idea is that we are proclaiming this. This prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom, is this sort of spell or a chant or a magic formula, you might say, to go a little too deeply into mysticism, through which we can go to the other shore from this shore. And the other shore and this shore are set up as described as samsara, this everyday world of patience that we live in, where we have all the problems, right? As against, over and against nirvana. Nirvana is conceived of as liberation. It's not quite paradise, but it would be going to, in our own mind, you might say, going to another shore of this same river that we're on, where all is liberation, all is free. We're not subject to the same confusion and limitations that we are in samsara. But one of my teachers, Okamura Roshi, was here, and he was talking about this idea. And he said, but if you go to nirvana, nobody's there. It is empty. There's nobody there. Because only bodhisattvas can go there. Only the bodhisattva, enlightening being, can go to nirvana. And they choose to stay here to help all other beings. And so he said, our charge is to translate samsara, this everyday world, into nirvana, where this world itself becomes the pure land, sometimes expressed, or this existence that we have becomes the liberation that we're looking for. So rather than hope for it in a future life, hope for it in after death, afterlife, that we pay attention to what can we do here to make this life work for us and for everybody else. It's the Bodhisattva vow. Make sense? How are we doing on time?
Yes, it does. I think our time is up. That's a good note to end it on, I think. That.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sensei.
And join us next week. We'll have another interview about Shakyamuni's teaching. Next Thursday, the 20th. You okay? Is that good for you?
Yeah.
Well done.
How was it? Well done. Sensei had a good explanation.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, now you understand
Sensei.
a little bit more about the Heart Sutra. Actually, this is like about 1% of the actual sutra.
It's much longer.
Highly condensed.
The Heart Sutra has hundreds of thousands of lines. Like, I forgot how many hundreds of thousands. Like, it's like 18 volumes or something. Like,
It's called Baha.
it has like 1,000, I don't know, but I know it has over 1,000
There are
verses.
different versions of it.
Yeah, 1,000. And there's different volumes or different scrolls, as they call it in old days.
I think of this as like the Reader's Digest condensed version.
Yeah, that's a very condensed version.
All those different versions from different,
No.
adapted to different cultures?
No.
That's from
No,
different-
the original version is very long.
Oh, so, okay. We're in the first
The original
century.
version was written in Sanskrit, I think. And it's very long.
But remember, they were chanting.
Yeah.
They had a lot of repetition. This one is chanted in most Zen temples, at least around the world. I think largely because of its brevity. But as I often say, if you put an underline on a lot of these phrases, like a link, you clicked on them, they'd bring up a whole other teaching about that. So this is kind of.
This is very popular among Mahayanas.
Yeah.
Not all Buddhist temples, just Mahayanas.
Yeah. Then you have the Ichiran who only chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, just the title. They just chant the title. That's another one.
Yeah. I like this because this is like one of the very few, maybe I have not come across any other sutras that place Avalokiteshvara in there. I like that. It's kind of confusing. I'm trying to remember when I read they made me read this in school, the actual sutra.
Did you ever read this in Chinese?
Well, only the short version is hanging around here. So it was Buddha talking to Shariputra?
Yeah, Shariputra was a living disciple.
Because sometimes when you read the short version, it's like, is it Avalokiteshvara talking to Shariputra or Buddha talking?
That's why I said he's channeling Avalokiteshvara.
Yeah, because some people
He's saying this is what happened.
Because some people think Avalokiteshvara is talking, but usually sutras is always Buddha talking.
He's speaking through Buddha, you could say.
So it was Buddha talking
To Shariputra. But he's testifying as to Avalokiteshvara's experience.
Okay, so he's talking about Avalokiteshvara. So
But
Buddha was saying
he's not reporting, he knows what Avalokiteshvara experienced.
Okay.
Because he's also experienced.
So who's the speaker? Who's the speaker in this?
Shakyamuni.
No, I thought you just said it's Avalokiteshvara.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's no separation of Shakyamuni and Avalokiteshvara.
So Avalokiteshvara, the
Bodhisattva
is talking then.
Is manifested as Shakyamuni.
Okay.
And vice versa.
But Avalokiteshvara is the one talking to Shariputra then, even though it was
through Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni is testifying to.
No, but who's the actual speaker? Like somebody said Shariputra da 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 da.
Shakyamuni is sitting there talking to Shariputra, but he's speaking as Avalokiteshvara. When you do your shiho, your final ceremony, your teacher puts the robe over their head and they speak to you as Avalokiteshvara.
The teacher?
Yeah.
Ooh.
I got that right. Okamura Roshi, they did it.
With you?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I have to look at it again, but I think that's the same reference.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not exactly mystical. The whole idea is that when you wake up to your Buddha nature, you are Buddha. And you're not different or separate from Shakyamuni. Nyojo, Dogen's teacher, said, gouge out your eyes so you no longer see.
Mm-hmm.
Break off your nose so you no longer smell. Pull out your tongue so you no longer taste. Plug up your ears so you no longer hear. Burn the body so you no longer feel. And then let that be filled with Buddha's eyes, Buddha's ears, Buddha's nose, Buddha's tongue.
Chris, do you have any thoughts about the content of the sutra?
You didn't have a chance to ask a question, but
yeah, when we were reading it and when he was talking about it, like, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, the part where it says no sensation, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, and then it lists the sense organ or the physical equivalents of those aggregates.
Mm-hmm.
The part about okay. I don't have any questions.
Okay. There's a lot of nodes, right? Actually, you see that a lot in sutra. They don't tell us what there is. They just tell us what there is not. No this, no that.
Yeah.
When it says what there's not, so what does it leave past there being no sensation, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, no eyes, no ears, no nose?
I think a glib way to respond to
What is
that
your
is say,
question? You
not as we think it is. In one of Dogen's teachings, he said, how did it begin? I'm trying to go back far enough.
But you're right. Yes, this is not as what is seen because
Well, instead of saying no this or no
It's
that,
just
they
a-
say non. So non-thinking, he talks about non-thinking. It doesn't mean the same as not thinking. But in this one, it's a wonderful thing of birth and death. He says, it is an established way in Buddha Dharma to deny that birth turns into death. Accordingly, one translator says, uh, this being so, death is this being so, established way in Buddha Dharma to deny that birth turns into death. Then it goes on to say, accordingly, birth is understood as no birth. Now, another translator said birth is understood as non-birth.
I never heard of that.
Well, if you think of no birth, it means the complete absence of birth, right? There is no such thing. And he goes on to say,
What is no birth?
right, but he goes on to say, it is an unshakable teaching in Buddha's discourse that death does not turn into birth. Accordingly, death is understood as no death. The other translator says non-death. Non-death. Okay, so this is splitting hairs semantically.
That's just words.
Oh,
After
there's
a
a
little
big,
while, it all just seems like a bunch of mumbo jumbo.
Well,
After a little
of
while.
course it is, it's words. But I think there's a big difference between no birth. We think of no birth and no death. What's it? Well, but if we say non-birth, non-death, think of the process of being born. You've had children, so you know there's a long gestation period and something happens before then. Before then, it's this long lead up to this exception where the baby's actually born in the hospital, but that isn't the actual beginning of that life, right? That's just the point at which the child comes out of the womb.
Right?
That's what we call birth, in quotes. Then when you die, when one dies, there is the death of the heart stops, the breathing stops, then the heart stops. Then there's what is called brain death. And they're at all different times. And so you can't find the exact point at which there is death in time.
Especially if you look at there is such a thing. If you believe there's rebirth, then you never die. It's just your body died. What is
Well, the body dies, but everything else, according to Buddhism, also comes to a transition point. It's not an end. I don't think
Right.
we could call it an end. And any death is understood to be the birth of something else, the birth of what then follows.
The
So
cycle.
back to Chris's
the
point,
cycle of
if you say no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, it's saying really non-seeing, non-hearing, non-smelling, non-tasting, non-thinking, right? That is, it's not that there is no such thing, but it's the non-dualistic reality of such a thing. So, hearing, where does hearing occur? Does hearing occur in the eardrum? Does it occur in those little bones? Does it occur in the brain, that part of the brain that receives the hearing stimulus? does it occur out here in the air where the air is compressed by the source of the sound, the fan of the furnace? Is that where hearing occurs? Where is it? When you try to find it, just like trying to find birth or death, you can't find it. And Buddhism is scientific in the sense that it's based on findings. So Buddha could rightly say, we have this concept of Atman, the soul, self, that survives death and is living in this body and takes on another body next lifetime. He says, I don't find that. I can't find that. In my experience, it's not there. He talked about the chariot being spread out all over the floor. Where's the chariot once it's totally dissembled, taken apart? So that's what he was saying. The self is once you take apart the aggregates, there's no there. There's no self in between the aggregates, right? So in the same sense, you can look at thinking, non-thinking. If you read Sharingama Sutra, he goes into this in great detail about how the senses work and how you can't find where the mind is.
What was the name of that again?
Sharingama, S-U-R-A-N-G-A-M-A. Send me a note if you want. I'll send it back to you.
That's why if you look at kanji, there's no such word for the mind.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Kanji?
There's shin, which is
Heart
heart.
mind.
Yeah. There's the heart mind or the
No separate mind like Cartesian, the idea of Cartesian spirit, you know.
But in Buddha's Dharma, there's the true mind, right? And then there's the conventional mind.
Constructed mind and big mind, capital
Mhm.
M mind.
Yeah.
But capital M mind doesn't exclude anything. There's nothing outside of it. So you can say it.
Mhm.
There's no such thing because it is everything.
Mhm. It's everything, but yet it's nothing, like you said, because you can't really see it or find it.
Can't find it.
Only the conventional, temporary ones.
And
which-
Sokan was a Rinzai teacher, came over with Soen Shaku, and he made a similar point about the fire hydrant. He said, fire hydrant is there, the dog, a chicken, and a person sees it. He said, only the person sees the red. So where's the red? The red is a real but non-existent dharma. If I say red, you know what I mean. That color is red, right? Red, orange. Yeah, we all understand
But
that.
not if you're colorblind.
Not if you're colorblind. And I'm sure you don't see the same color as I see,
No.
and neither do you.
I actually had a friend in high school. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
That was the first time I encountered colorblind. It's like, yeah, so when you say what it is whatever that person perceived at that
Dogs
moment.
don't see it. Dogs don't see it. Chickens don't see it.
Mhm.
Only the person sees it. But the
my
dog
chemistry
sees
partner, yeah.
Huh?
And my chemistry partner when I was in high school, he's truly colorblind. He would see colors totally different than colors I see.
Yeah.
So much
That's
for
why
reality.
the red, yellow, and green
Maybe-
lights are always arranged the
Maybe
same way.
we're
on
all
streetlights.
colorblind and he's not.
He's seeing a different part of the spectrum. So he said, where's the red? The fire hydrant is a real and existent dharma because the dog pees on it, and the chicken sees it, and then kick it with your toe, it'll break your toe. But the red, where's the red?
But
It's a similar kind of question.
the Heart Sutra is very interesting, and I always just even wonder. I'm not surprised, but I mean, I don't know. I always wonder, like when I first start chanting it, it doesn't really mean that much initially. You know what I'm saying? Initially, it's like, so now I always think, like, what does it mean to other people when they're reading this? I mean, even now, after studying so many different versions and commentaries and practicing and chanting and all that, I don't know, it kind of makes sense to me, but it's very hard to describe it. That's why when you said I should interview you about the Heart Sutra, I said, oh my God. It's so hard to talk about it, right? It's so hard to explain
I
it.
thought you did great. I thought your interview was great.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I was just using my beginner's mind.
Yeah, nobody expects anybody to understand any of this from the beginning, but by repetition, by chanting it again and again. Mike was saying that today at lunch, Mike Goldman, he said he remembers the day he started chanting the Heart Sutra without looking at the card.
Uh-huh.
And he hadn't intentionally, we were talking about memorization.
Yeah.
He said he hadn't intentionally tried to memorize it,
Uh-huh.
but somehow he just knew it.
Oh, that happens to
after
me
so many
too.
repetitions, you know.
That happens to me too. Actually, I remember I was here in December, and Sankyu was here. Sankyu was, I don't know, he hasn't moved away. He's moved away, right? And I started, I think this is a very easy mantra to cite in a group, especially because it's so repetitious.
Mhm.
And then I didn't have the paper, so I just kind of start kind of like going on memory. And yeah, once you get going, especially when there's a group, the words keep popping up in your head. So I just start chanting it out. And Saki goes, "How did you memorize that? Like, how come you know how to?" I said, "Well, it's half memory and half going along with the group. It's kind of like
Yeah.
after a while, it just becomes a song."
The Japanese was hard for me. I had to actually
The Japanese is
think
very
in
hard.
English, think in English while I was chanting the
The
Japanese.
Japanese, I would remember 2 lines, and then 3 days later, I would forget. I don't know how you do it. The Japanese is very hard. But maybe that's my challenge to myself. I do want to memorize the Japanese.
I learned what the Japanese words meant, and so I could hear the meaning while I was chanting in Japanese.
Okay. I'm
But
studying the
then after a while, that
Japanese
went away.
alphabets now. Maybe that would help once I understand the alphabets. If I could read it in Japanese, it would help.
Send me a note. I've got Sensei's original version, has the calligraphy,
Oh, okay.
and has the pronunciation,
Okay.
and has the English. And the English is
Oh.
very choppy because it really doesn't flow the way English
Yeah.
flows.
The Japanese
But
sounds
I've got a
much
copy
better.
of that I can give you.
I like the sound of Japanese ones.
And then you can see, you can read it
Okay.
vertically this way to see
Oh, good.
whatever.
And that's a great way to learn Japanese too, through sutras.
Yep.
Instead of just memorizing each letter. So.
Yep.
Okay, it's 8 o'clock.
Can we break set?
Yes, we shall.
We went from 7 to 8, right? We were already past 8, right?
No, we only lasted about. The
The
interview was only about 35 minutes.
Oh, we should have asked some questions. Didn't think.
Oh, I didn't know if you wanted him to talk.
Yeah.
Do a Q&A at the end next time.
Yeah, we
could
should.
do a
We should.
Q&A at the end next time. The last.
Yeah,
15
we should.
minutes.
Yeah, we should.
We should.
We should next time. Yeah.
You want to do something else, you said?
No, he said, should we do Q&A next time?
Next time.
I said, yeah.
Yeah, I think we always want to have like a talk show. You have
Yeah.
the monologue, in
Mhm.
which case we chanted this, and then you have the interview. Whether I'm interviewing somebody they're interviewing. I won't be here next week. I think you and I will go to the art show
The
opening.
show. Yeah, and
And I was
Kido.
asking Andrew if he can interview Keto next week,
Okay, and Andrew said maybe. Hold on.
maybe. And then toward the end, the last 15 minutes or so.
What,
So say the first 15 minutes is the introduction,
what is the ZENtalk on? What is the topic for next Thursday anyway?
Metta Sutta was
Oh,
attributed to Buddha. Then the half hour is the interview, right? And then the last 15 minutes should be Q&A with the audience. Something like that. That makes sense. So you get a little mix.
yeah, if you have audience, but it's hard if just have.
Or what I
We
think
have
what I'm
our
trying to do
audience.
is avoid the talking head person just talking.
I know, but when we don't have audio participation or audience here, it's kind of hard.
Well, we'll get better at it. We just started.
I know.
We've only done, what, 4 of these?
I don't know. Do you really?
Something.
So do you really want to even do it next week?
I think so. I mean, if Andrew and Keto want to do it, it's fine with me.
Okay.
I just think I have to go to this.
Yeah.
The art thing is like collectors and
I know.
artists all getting together, so I have to be there.
Okay. Yeah. If Kido and Andrews could do it, that's fine.
Yeah.
If not,
Andrew's a very good interviewer.
we'll just go to the art show. Oh. Anybody could go to the art show, right?
Anybody can